Man, it's so good to be out here this summer. Yes, love it. I love it. I'll tell you, these posts are for shade that is on the way, okay? Not like on the way, like it'll be here in the next 10 minutes, but on the way, like hopefully next week, okay? That's what we're working on it. So the shade is on the way. I would love to invite you, if you would, find your magazine and turn to page 14. Page 14 in the magazine. One of the parts of our liturgy this summer is called FML, Forgive My Life. Forgive My Life, FML. And what we'd love this summer to have folks do, there's a QR code there, and you can send in stories, like, kind of like facepalm stories, or like maybe you've got this like true confession, like I've never told anybody this story, but I got to get it out. And you'll stay anonymous, all right? So we won't say who you are, but one of the ways we want to kind of share in this summer together is sharing some of these stories together. Today I have a story. We actually, Pastor Phil, where are you at, Pastor Phil? All right, everyone say hi, Pastor Phil. Phil is up for anything, and so this is his story. He gets the only non-anonymous story, okay? So we needed someone to go first. This is from Pastor Phil. He says, one Sunday morning, as I was on the way to my church in Kansas City to teach an adult Bible study, I saw a car pulled off the road. It had a flat tire or an engine problem or some issue, and no one was there to help. This was before anyone carried a cell phone, so that's how old Phil is, by the way. This was before anyone carried a cell phone, so it was customary to stop and offer assistance. But I was the one leading the Bible study, and a delay like this would make me late. Being the leader, I figured it was okay to pass by, and surely someone else would stop and help. I guess I should mention that the passage we were studying that morning was Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan. You know, the one where the religious leader passed by the guy on the side of the road because their religious duty seemed more important than helping him. The irony didn't hit me until I got to church. Oh man, how was I going to teach this parable when it was about guys like me? I felt like such a hypocrite. Well, I thought at least no one in the room will know. We started the class and one of our regular members walked in late and yeah, he was the guy broken down on the side of the road. Can we just say, Pastor Phil, you are forgiven, huh? This summer, we're going to be doing a bit of a book study. All summer, we're going to be in the New Testament book of Galatians. If you were here last summer, we did a bit of a book study on the book of James. Now, what you might not know is there's a connection between these two books. The book of James was a book written to the church in Jerusalem, the church where it all started, a church made up of primarily Jewish folks who came to Jesus through maybe seeing or meeting someone who was there at the resurrection or at Pentecost. Now, the church in Galatia is a church that covers this whole region called Galatia. There's actually a lot of small churches in this whole region, but the Galatian church was the first church that had like non-Jewish leadership. So the church in Galatia was really diverse, but diverse without Jewish leadership. It was diverse from all these different people and nationalities that found themselves in Galatia. Now, the connection between these two churches is that the book of Galatians is written by this guy named Paul after some missionaries from James's church in Jerusalem came to the church in Galatia and began telling them they needed to obey some Jewish laws. This did not make Paul very happy. And so the book of Galatia, or the book of Galatians, is actually a rebuke of the church in Jerusalem and some of the things they're trying to get other churches to adhere to. I have to give a bit of a warning as we read this book. There's a lot of mention of circumcision in the book, okay? So I'm just going to get out there right now. It actually reminds me, when I was in college, I sang in a choir in college, and we went on this kind of choir tour every year. And this year, our choir tour brought us through New York, and we were in New York City, and we sang at this Caribbean church or Caribbean church, depending which, whether you're a northerner or a southerner. We went to this church made up of all folks who were from the Caribbean. And the church had this pastor, his name was Dr. Anthony, and when he would preach, the organ player would stay on stage, right? And so he'd be preaching, he'd make this really strong point, and the organ would be like, "Blah!" And so we're there this day. Church lasted 6 hours. There was allegedly 2 services and 2 meals. I could not figure out when one service ended and the next one started, but I sang twice, we ate twice. And on this day, the pastor was speaking from the book of Galatians, and he was preaching on one of these circumcision passages. And so he's coming along, and the organ is going, and he's preaching, he's getting more and more fired up. And then he would say, now turn to your neighbor and tell him to cut it off. And the organ would go, woo, right? And so just the whole morning. And so we're all these Canadian white kids from the north who are like looking at each other like, is this okay? Like, are we going to be in trouble for this? And so the book of Galatians can be a bit of abrasive, but I want to let you know that the book of Galatians is actually not about circumcision. That's just the center topic. That's the law of the day. It's the religion of the day. That's the centerpiece, because for thousands of years, circumcision was the marker of belonging for the Jewish community. And it was the marker of a family's intent to be formed and shaped by the law for the rest of their life. And so you can understand, as these churches are forming outside of Jerusalem and they're having these new experiences that have nothing to do with the laws of Judaism. And as these Jewish Christians are going, well, wait a minute. I think you all should be a part of what we're doing. You should be a part of this history. You know, they say there are 2 ways to build a community. It's very similar to raising cattle, they actually say, all right? Can you imagine this? There's 2 ways to keep cattle around. One way is to build a fence in a field, right? And all the cattle will stay in the field. Another way is to dig a well in the middle of the field, and all the cows will stay close to the well. It's very similar to how many communities function. Some communities build fences to keep people in. Other communities dig wells to allow people to come close and move towards the source. Sociologists would suggest that communities are often described sometimes as bounded communities, right? Like there's a fence around the community, and the way you belong is by staying inside the bounds of the community. To step outside those bounds would be to transgress the community, and there'd be laws and punishments or realities for that. Some communities, sociologists say, are fuzzy. They're just no one's really sure how we all belong here, but we just do. We don't really ever kind of talk about what we're about. We're just only about belonging and helping people stay. And so belonging gets a little bit fuzzy. And then some communities are centered. There's something that they're trying to center together and move together towards as a community. The book of Galatians, Paul is calling out the ways in which the Jerusalem church wants to maybe put bounds on these churches in Galatia. He's also calling out the ways in which they are fuzzy about the grace that God has given through their behaviors. And what he's calling both the church in Jerusalem and the church in Galatia to is to be centered in the grace and love of Jesus Christ. Galatians chapter 2, starting in verse 11, kind of frames up the book. I want to read this for us. It says, when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face. This is Galatians chapter 2, verse 11. Because he was wrong. He had been eating with the Gentiles before certain people came from James. But when they came, he began to back out and separate himself because he was afraid of the people who promoted circumcision. And the rest of the Jews also joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas got carried away with them in their hypocrisy. See, the church in Antioch had just gone through a pretty significant church split over these same reasons. There were some people who said, no. You want to be a follower of Jesus? You want to be a Christian? You have to obey these certain laws and rules. And the church split over it. Paul was livid about this church split. And now he's watching the same kind of thing happen in this church in Galatia. And so he says, when I went to Cephas and I said, listen, what you did in Antioch was wrong. The ways in which you divided that community over these laws were wrong. That can't happen again. He goes on to say, you're kind of fuzzy about grace. And so people were a little bit confused because you used to spend time eating with them and socializing with them. But now, because they weren't the kinds of Christians you wanted them to be, you stopped eating with them in socializing with them. He tried to put new boundaries on them, say, listen, you want to be a follower of Jesus, you need to be circumcised. There's these kind of legal boundaries that he put on this church, and it divided that church. I don't know if you've been around church a long time, but this stuff still happens today, right? I mean, it's really common actually in churches. For those of us who were like there back then, that are here now, that will try to we begin to maybe see our roles as like rulers or knowers. Like, I've been around here, I know how things should be. Or even protectors sometimes, right? God did something in our church way back then, and now this new thing is happening, and I feel like I'm the one who has to protect the old thing among new things. While those who maybe are having some new experiences with Jesus, finding liberation in this movement of the Spirit, often find themselves willing to do just about anything to have access to that grace and that community. You see how this can happen in churches back then and can still happen in churches today. And to be really honest, it's fair. I mean, fences are safe, right? Fences help keep us in, but it also helps keep predators away. And this kind of culture of, you know what, if you don't believe in the same way I do, I'm going to go over here and eat with people who do, is actually a really effective way to try to control community. Some of you might be familiar with some cultures that operate on an honor-shame culture. Churches often operate in this honor and shame culture. We're going to honor the people who behave a certain way and shame those who don't. And it does this thing in communities where those who feel that shame long to be in the seat of honor. And those who are in the seat of honor will do anything to protect that seat. Many of you know, I've shared this many times, but my family came to faith later in life, so we kind of learned about church together. And I remember when we first started going to church after my parents came to faith, it was our first year in this new church. And it was October, and my parents came home from church and said, hey guys, we're not gonna celebrate Halloween this year. And I was like, well, why not? Oh, she said, I guess, my mom said, well, Christians don't celebrate Halloween. And so we shut the lights off on October 31st and went bowling together as a family. Now, I had a great time bowling, so I wasn't too worried about it. But then the next year, some other Christian came along and said, actually, a lot of Christians celebrate Halloween and let their kids go trick-or-treating. So that year we celebrated Halloween, right? We didn't know. I remember one Sunday, it was 3 or 4 years after my family had come to faith, and there was a heated conversation in the lobby in the church between my mom and somebody else, as this somebody else was trying to tell my mom that she shouldn't let me play hockey on Sundays because Christians don't play sports on Sundays. Now, my parents had been Christians a little longer then, and maybe the grace of God had been more realized to them then, and my mom stood up for me in the lobby that day, and I'm so thankful that as a kid, I got to learn about the grace of God at my own pace, in my own timing, not through the lens of a fence or a law. It wasn't many years ago that I was working at a church, a different church than this one. And there was this young lady who was serving in the church, and she got pregnant. And the leader of that church, leader of that group, told her that she wasn't allowed to serve at church anymore because she was pregnant. And what was maybe difficult about that is that there was actually a lot of people serving who were living together unmarried and having sex outside of marriage, but because this girl got pregnant and was going to show, they told her she couldn't serve at church anymore. And so my wife and I did what we normally do. We actually invited that girl to come live with us. And then my wife went and let that guy have it, who put that rule together. But I think this stuff happens often in church, right? That we want to build these arbitrary fences over arbitrary reasons around the grace of God. Or we want to create an honor and shame culture around the grace of God. And what this book of Galatians will do over and over and over again is call the community of the church to center the grace of God. Be transformed and shaped by this grace of God, to be drawn in by this grace of God. Now, I want to say it's not wrong to have theological convictions. It's not wrong to have biblical convictions in your life, but it is wrong to take those convictions and rob someone else or a people group from experiencing God's grace, because you need to build a fence where Jesus is inviting someone else in. The book of Galatians is a rebuke of these historic Christians, but it's an invitation to everyone to center the grace of God and see what God might do as we all learn to swim in the ocean of his grace. What's interesting about the book of Galatians is the author, Paul, might be just the perfect person to bring this rebuke. Paul grew up, he describes himself a Jew of Jews. He followed all of the rules, he went through all the laws, he did everything just right, but then he had a radical moment where he was faced with the grace of God in his life, and it changed him completely. And then his mission in life was to travel around to all of these newfound churches all over the region. And he was seeing again and again and again on the possibilities that are things that are possible when the grace of God touches down in a group of people. And so he stands up for this church in Galatia and says, listen, continue to center the grace of God. And he stands against this church in Jerusalem and said, we're not building those fences here. The grace of God will change us and form us. I think this is a really important book study for us this summer. Why? Because our church, I think, has a lot to learn from, but a lot to prepare for. A few weeks ago, I was standing on stage proclaiming that I long for our church to be a church for anyone. Anyone remember this message? And we had people self-identify all the different faith traditions we've come from, right? That we have historic faith traditions at our church from everywhere, that our church is really ecumenical. We're gathering people from all different faith backgrounds. And you could see, right, in our church, how some of us might want to build fences because of some of our own histories and convictions, but how it's so important for us to center grace. But also we come from different markers inside of this church. I mean, how many of you were here when this church met in a school? Anybody? Yeah, lots of hands out there. How many of you are here when this church broke ground on this hill for the first time? Get some more people. How many of you are here for when we got in a lot of trouble for having porn weekend at the church? Anyone remember that one? Yeah. Oh, by the way, if you weren't here, there was no porn shown at church, okay? It was a conversation about the effects of pornography on our society. How many of you were here when we started meeting on the hill for maybe the first time because it was shut down for COVID? How many of you, your only understanding of Westwinds Church is just in the last 3 years? So even here, even just in the history of our church, we represent different eras of how God has done new things among us. And it is the human temptation to try to pull things from the past to build fences in the future. You know what's really incredible about us right now? This is my first time almost falling every week. Is as far as churches go, y'all, we're still the first generation of this church. That churches live for a really long time. That we're the first generation of this church. And this letter that Paul is writing, pushing back the historic church because he wants to protect the first generation of the church in Galatia. That in this infancy of your church, don't build fences in places where we ought to be building wells. So as we read the book of Galatians this summer, maybe you can consider whether you're reading it like a Galatian, someone maybe who's new to God's grace or experiencing God's grace in new ways. Or you're tempted to read it like a missionary from Jerusalem, someone who longs to protect something from the past or build fences around our future. Actually, I think a better way to read the book is probably to ask yourself, in what ways am I like the Galatian Christian? And in what ways am I like these missionaries from Jerusalem? And as we move through this summer, I wonder in which ways God might awaken us to his grace. I actually want to finish with Paul's testimony in the book. Galatians chapter 2, verse 19 to 21. This is Paul's great proclamation about why this is so personal to him. He says this in his letter. He says, I died to the law, through the law, so that I could live for God. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. And the life I now live in my body, I live by faith, indeed, by the faithfulness of God's Son, who loved me and gave himself for me. He says, I don't ignore the grace of God, because if we've become righteous through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. I'm going to read that line one more time. I don't ignore the grace of God, because if we become righteous through the law, then Christ died for no purpose.
Merciful God, we long to love you with our whole hearts. We long to love our neighbor as ourselves, to be people of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. It is for freedom Christ set us free. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. We confess we struggle to embrace your grace. We confess we try to earn, control, hoard, and avoid grace. Our reluctance to accept grace hinders our ability to share it. It is for freedom Christ set us free. Lord, in your mercy, we confess we struggle with our humanness, with our limitations and the limitations of others. We confess the divisions within us and divisions between us. We long to love, and we're still learning how. It is for freedom Christ set us free. Lord, in your mercy, we confess our pride, envy, anger, apathy, greed, gluttony, and lust. We confess the histories we carry in our hearts and bodies, hurts we pass on with our thoughts, words, and actions. It is for freedom Christ set us free. Lord, in your mercy, have mercy on us and forgive us. We long to love you with our whole heart. Holy Spirit, free us to love our neighbor as ourselves. Holy Spirit, free us to be people of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. It is for freedom Christ set us free. Lord, in your mercy. Amen. And together we'll pray the Lord's Prayer, which is on page 20, so it should be right next to it. Our Father, in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.